Chapter 1: The Grocery Store Incident. John Marshall hated 3 things with consistent passion. First, people who spoke too loudly in enclosed spaces. Second, people who thought 6th graders were easy to teach. Third, and most passionately, people who commented on his height. Unfortunately, the universe seemed determined to test his patience on all 3 fronts at exactly 6:47 p.m. in the frozen foods aisle of Greenmart. "Tony, please don't grab the fish sticks," John muttered, adjusting the 1-year-old on his hip while balancing a basket with his free hand. Tony responded by squealing in delight and slapping the plastic packaging anyway. John sighed. "I know. Fish sticks are exciting. But Uncle John is one loud noise away from committing a felony." Tony blinked at him, unbothered, then pressed his forehead against John's collarbone. John immediately softened. "Okay," John murmured, voice gentler. "That was cute. You win." He reached for a pack of diapers with the careful precision of a man who had learned, through pain and humiliation, that gravity did not care about his 5 feet 4 inches frame or his fragile remaining dignity. That was when everything went wrong. A blur of expensive cologne, rushed footsteps, and poorly timed momentum collided with his side. "Oh shit, sorry." John staggered back, heart leaping straight into his throat as Tony slipped a few inches in his arms. "Hey!" John snapped, tightening his grip instantly, cradling Tony protectively. "Watch where you're." He looked up, and up, and up. The man in front of him was tall. Not normal tall, offensively tall. The kind of tall that blocked fluorescent lighting and made John's neck ache just looking. 6 feet, maybe more. Broad shoulders. Dark hair hastily shoved back. Expensive coat. Panicked eyes. The stranger froze. "Oh my God. Are you okay? I didn't see you. I was rushing." "I noticed," John said flatly, rocking Tony slightly when the baby whimpered. "You almost dropped my nephew." The man's face drained of color. I'm so sorry. I swear I wasn't looking at my phone. I was just..." John raised an eyebrow. "Running people over?" Tony chose that moment to grab a handful of the man's coat and giggle. John blinked. The stranger blinked. "Hi," the man said weakly to the baby. Tony squealed again, clearly delighted. John scowled. "Traitor." That earned him a confused laugh. "I'm Luke Cowell, and I'm really, really sorry." John studied him despite himself. Luke had the kind of face that belonged on business school brochures. Open, handsome, annoyingly sincere. Too young. Definitely too young. "John," he said curtly. "And this is Tony, who you nearly turned into a cautionary tale." Luke winced. "I deserve that." "Yes, you do." Luke hesitated, then gestured awkwardly. "Can I, help? With anything? Groceries? Carry something?" John almost said no out of pure reflex. Then Tony reached out again, fingers curling into Luke's sleeve like it belonged there. John sighed. "Of course." "Fine," he muttered. "But if you comment on my height, I will abandon you in this aisle." Luke blinked, then smiled. "Wasn't planning on it." They walked together toward the checkout, Luke carrying the basket while John kept Tony close. Silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just unexpected. "So," Luke said eventually, careful, "is Tony your son?" John stiffened. "Nephew." "Oh, sorry." "His parents left," John said before he could stop himself. Something about Luke's tone, curious but not intrusive, lowered his guard. "He's autistic. 1 year old. Loud places are a lot." Luke nodded slowly. "You're doing great." John scoffed. "You don't know that." "I know you didn't drop him," Luke said gently. "And you're holding him like he's the most important thing in the world." John's throat tightened. He looked away. At the checkout, Tony reached for Luke again, this time patting his cheek with sticky fingers. Luke laughed softly. "I think he likes me." John rolled his eyes. "He likes ceiling fans and bubble wrap. Don't let it go to your head." Still, when Luke smiled, warm, easy, unguarded, John felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Something inconvenient. Something dangerous. And very, very young. Chapter 2 almost but not quite. John Marshall did not think about the tall stranger from the grocery store. He definitely did not think about the way Luke Cowell had apologized like he meant it. Or how he'd held the basket without acting like it was some grand gesture. Or how Tony, traitor that he was, had smiled at him. No. John was a grown man with a job, a mortgage, and a 1-year-old who screamed like a malfunctioning smoke alarm when the wrong spoon was used. He did not have time to think about 20-year-olds. Mr. Marshall. John snapped back to reality just in time to catch a paper airplane aimed directly at his face. He caught it midair without looking. The class went silent. Yes, John said calmly. I know you're all impressed. No, I will not be joining the Olympics. Laughter rippled through the room. Now, he continued, pacing in front of the board. Who can tell me one thing, just one, about the Ming Dynasty that does not involve kung fu movies? A hand shot up. They had really good pottery? Correct, John said. And also devastating political corruption. Much like your group projects. The kids groaned. John hid a smile and turned back to the board. This was the part of his life that made sense. Controlled chaos. Predictable disasters. Children who listened when he raised an eyebrow and stopped talking when he lowered his voice. No confusing smiles. No inconvenient height differences. After school, John collected Tony from daycare, the baby already half asleep, cheek pressed against his shoulder. They stopped by the small cafe near their apartment. John's one indulgence on particularly exhausting days. That was when the bell over the door rang. John froze. Luke walked in. He looked different out of the grocery store. Casual. Hoodie. Backpack slung over one shoulder. Still tall. Still annoyingly noticeable. John turned away instantly. John. Damn it. Luke approached slowly, like he wasn't sure he was welcome. Hey. Hi. John sighed. There was no pretending now. Hi, he said stiffly. Luke smiled, relieved. I wasn't sure it was you. I thought maybe I was being creepy. You are, John said flatly. Luke laughed. Fair. He gestured to Tony. How's he doing? Tony, who had been half asleep, opened one eye, looked at Luke and reached out. John closed his eyes. Unbelievable. Luke's smile softened, but he didn't touch, just stayed still. Hi again, buddy. John shifted Tony higher on his hip. This is a coincidence, he said firmly. I know, Luke replied. I didn't follow you, I swear. I live nearby. John eyed him suspiciously. Luke raised both hands. I can point out my building if you want. That won't be necessary. They stood there awkwardly until Luke cleared his throat. I still have your bag. John blinked. You didn't. I grabbed it before you left, Luke said. I kept forgetting to bring it. He handed it over. John took it. Their fingers brushed. He hated that he noticed. Thank you, John said quietly. Luke hesitated. Can I, buy you a coffee? As an apology. No. Luke nodded. Okay. John paused. Fine, he added. But only because Tony's asleep. Luke smiled like he'd just won something small but precious. They sat. Talked about nothing important. Luke didn't ask too many questions. John didn't volunteer answers. And when they left, John told himself firmly that this meant nothing. Absolutely nothing. Which was why the idea of not seeing Luke again felt strangely disappointing. Chapter 3 Lines that shouldn't blur. John Marshall noticed patterns for a living. It was a skill honed by years of teaching 12-year-olds who believed subtlety was optional and lying was an art form. Patterns kept him sane. Patterns explained chaos. Which was why the third time he saw Luke Cowell that week, John knew he was in trouble. The first time had been the cafe. Fine. Coincidence. The second time was outside the daycare 2 days later, Luke standing a respectable distance away, staring at his phone like he had absolutely no expectations of being acknowledged. John almost pretended he didn't see him. Almost. Luke looked up, surprised, then smiled. Not wide, not smug, just pleased. Hey, he said. John adjusted Tony on his hip. You're doing this on purpose. Luke winced. I swear I'm not. My internship office is 2 blocks down. Of course it is, John muttered. Tony leaned forward, fascinated by Luke's watch, sleek, metallic, catching the sunlight. Luke noticed immediately and turned his wrist so the reflection danced on the sidewalk. Tony stilled, watched, smiled. John swallowed. Your nephew's observant, Luke said softly. He misses nothing, John replied, except sleep schedules. Luke laughed quietly. Relatable. That was the problem. Luke didn't push. He didn't comment on Tony's lack of eye contact or flinch when Tony didn't respond to his voice. He just existed nearby like it was enough. It unsettled John more than forced enthusiasm ever could. They walked in the same direction without discussing it. John told himself it was practical. Same neighborhood. Nothing strange about that. You always this tired? Luke asked after a moment, tone light but careful. John snorted. This is my well-rested look. Luke studied him openly now. You're doing a lot. Alone. I'm not alone, John said automatically. Luke didn't argue, just nodded. Okay. That annoyed John. He preferred defensiveness he could fight. They reached the corner where Luke usually veered off. I should go, Luke said, hesitating. But, if you ever need help carrying groceries again. John stiffened. I don't need help. I know, Luke said quickly. Sorry. Bad phrasing. Silence stretched. Luke scratched the back of his neck. I'll see you around? John hesitated. He shouldn't encourage this. He shouldn't let it blur. Maybe, he said. Luke's smile was small but genuine. Maybe's good. That night, John lay awake long after Tony had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling fan. Too young, he told himself. Too tall. Too easy. He thought about the way Luke had noticed his exhaustion without turning it into pity. About how Tony had relaxed in his presence. This is how it starts, John thought. With small allowances. At school the next day, John snapped at a student for tapping his pencil. He apologized 5 minutes later. Mr. Marshall, a girl named Raina said thoughtfully. You're nicer when you're grumpy tired instead of angry tired. John blinked. That is not helpful. She shrugged. Just saying. After class, John found himself checking his phone more often than necessary. Not for messages, Luke didn't have his number. Which was worse. The next time they ran into each other, it was raining. Luke offered his umbrella without hesitation, stepping closer than strictly necessary. John could feel the warmth of him, smell faint soap and something expensive he didn't want to think about. I'm 39, John said abruptly. Luke blinked. Okay. You're 20, John continued. This is a bad idea. Luke considered that. Rain drummed softly around them. Then why does it feel like we're just talking? Luke asked. John had no answer. Tony shifted between them, fingers brushing Luke's sleeve. Luke didn't move away. John closed his eyes. The lines were blurring, and he was the one letting them. Chapter 4, The Space Between Steps. John Marshall was good at avoidance. It was a skill he'd mastered early, learned in faculty meetings, family gatherings, and any situation that required him to smile while quietly retreating. Avoidance kept things simple, clean, manageable. So when Luke Cowell stopped appearing outside the daycare, John told himself it was a relief. No more awkward coincidences. No more unspoken tension. No more noticing the way Tony seemed calmer when Luke was nearby. He focused instead on routine. Morning drop-off, work, pick-up, dinner, bath, bed. And yet, on Wednesday afternoon, John caught himself scanning the sidewalk anyway. Luke wasn't there. Good, John told himself firmly. That's good. At school, his students sensed the shift immediately. Mr. Marshall, Kevin said, squinting suspiciously. You're making more jokes than usual. That's because I'm happy, John replied dryly. Raina tilted her head. You only say that when you're not. John changed the subject. After work, John stopped by the grocery store, the same one he now resented for reasons he refused to examine. He kept his eyes forward, moved quickly, and absolutely did not linger by the produce section. He was halfway through checkout when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Excuse me, sorry. Can I? Thanks." John closed his eyes. Luke stood there, dressed sharper than usual. Pressed slacks, jacket, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, Mom," Luke was saying, voice tight but controlled. "I understand. No, I'm not late. I'll be there after." He caught sight of John and paused. "I have to go," Luke said into the phone. "I'll call you later." He ended the call and offered a small smile. "Hi." John nodded. "Hi." They stood, awkward again, the line inching forward. "You've been busy," Luke said neutrally. John knew what he meant. "Yes," John replied. "I am." Luke accepted that without protest. "Internship's been intense too." "That's good," John said. "Important." Luke studied him. "You're putting up walls." John's jaw tightened. "I'm setting boundaries." Luke considered that. "Okay." The cashier waved John forward. He paid quickly, slinging the bag over his shoulder. "I should go," John said. Luke nodded. "Of course." John took 3 steps. Then Luke spoke again. Not chasing, not loud. "I won't cross lines you draw," Luke said. "But I won't pretend I don't care either." John stopped. He didn't turn around. "That's not fair," John said quietly. Luke's voice softened. "Neither is pretending this is nothing." John finally faced him. "You're young. You have a life that hasn't narrowed yet." Luke didn't argue. Just said, "And you have one that's full." That landed harder than John expected. Luke stepped back, creating space. "I'll let you be." John nodded once. That night, John watched Tony line up his toys with meticulous care, humming softly to himself. John loved him fiercely, completely. There was no room for regret there. But later, alone, John sat on the edge of his bed and wondered when choosing responsibility had started to feel like loss. He told himself it would pass. It always did. Chapter 5. In the Silence of Absence. The days after the grocery store encounter felt like walking through a fog for John. Each time he glanced at the door, he half expected Luke to appear, but the silence remained unbroken. John busied himself with teaching, with Tony, with the small routines that kept his world intact. Yet, even in the bustle of his classroom, he found himself noticing the absence of Luke's quiet presence. One afternoon, as John prepared for a history lesson, he noticed Tony's gaze lingering on the window. The baby reached out, as if expecting someone who wasn't there. "Not today, Tony," John whispered, adjusting his glasses. "We'll see him another time." But as the days passed, Luke's absence became more palpable. John found himself wondering about the young man's life, the pressures he faced at home, and the expectations that weighed on him. It wasn't until the following weekend that John and Tony ventured out to the local park. The sun was bright, and children's laughter filled the air. John watched Tony's delight, but his mind kept drifting to Luke, wondering how he was doing. It was at the park's small cafe that John saw Luke again. He was sitting at a table, talking quietly on his phone, the lines of stress faintly visible on his face. John hesitated, then approached cautiously, Tony in tow. "Luke," John said, trying to keep his voice steady. Luke looked up, his expression softening immediately. "John." "And Tony." John nodded, feeling the distance between them but also the warmth that had never quite faded. They spoke quietly, Luke's tone respectful and gentle. Luke mentioned his parents' insistence on family dinners, and John listened, understanding the weight of expectations that Luke carried. "It's tough," Luke admitted, glancing at Tony. "But I want to be here, with both of you." John felt the familiar tug of conflicting emotions. He wanted to keep his distance, but he also couldn't deny the sincerity in Luke's eyes. As they spent the afternoon together, John watched Luke with Tony, noticing the genuine care and patience Luke showed. It was a small step, but it was a step toward understanding. By the time they left the park, the tension had eased just a bit, and John realized that maybe, just maybe, there was room for both care and boundaries. As they walked home, John found himself feeling a bit lighter, the lines between distance and connection beginning to blur in a way that felt right. Chapter 6, Weight and Measure. John Marshall believed that distance, once established, should behave politely. It should remain where it was put. It should not creep back into his thoughts while he waited for the kettle to boil, or while Tony methodically lined up plastic animals along the coffee table. Distance, in John's experience, was supposed to simplify things. Instead, Luke's absence had weight. Not dramatic, not sharp, just present, like humidity before rain. John didn't see Luke for nearly 2 weeks after the park. He told himself this was proof that boundaries worked, that Luke had listened, that nothing had been promised and therefore nothing was owed. He still caught himself glancing at tall silhouettes on the sidewalk. He hated that most of all. At school, he threw himself into work. The kids noticed, of course, they always did. "Mr. Marshall?" Raina said one afternoon, watching him erase the board with unnecessary force. "Are you mad at history?" "I am always mad at history," John replied. "It's deeply inconvenient." Kevin raised his hand. "Is this about love?" The class erupted. John stared at them. "Sit down." Kevin sat, smiling. That evening, daycare pickup ran late. Tony was overstimulated, his small hands fluttering against John's chest, breath uneven. "I know," John murmured, rocking him gently outside the building. "I know I'm here." A shadow fell across the pavement. John looked up. Luke stood a few feet away, hands visible, posture careful, as if approaching a skittish animal. "I won't come closer," Luke said immediately. Hi." John's first instinct was irritation. His second was relief. Both annoyed him. "You're going to undo all my progress," John said tiredly. Luke smiled faintly. "You looked like you could use backup." "I don't need." "I know," Luke interrupted softly. "But Tony might." That stopped him. Tony had noticed Luke already. His breathing slowed, not immediately, but enough to be measurable. John exhaled. 5 minutes, John said. "We're just waiting for a rideshare." Luke nodded. "Okay." They stood in silence, Luke keeping his distance, speaking quietly, to John, not Tony. "My parents think I'm wasting time," Luke said eventually. "They want me to focus. Career. Networking." John snorted. "Heaven forbid you pause." "They don't like things they can't measure," Luke said. "Titles. Numbers. Timelines." "And you?" John asked before he could stop himself. Luke glanced at Tony. "I measure things differently." John shifted his weight. "That's dangerous." Luke smiled sadly. "So I'm told." The car arrived too soon. John hesitated, then spoke quickly. "You didn't do anything wrong." Luke met his gaze. "I know. That was worse." He watched Luke walk away, tall frame disappearing into the crowd, and felt the familiar twist of guilt. Later that night, after Tony was asleep, John sat at the kitchen table with paperwork spread out in front of him. Forms, schedules, things that needed signatures and foresight. He was tired, so tired. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He stared at it. Then it buzzed again. "Luke, Mrs. Alvarez gave me your number. I told her not to, but she scares me." John groaned aloud. "John, she scares everyone." "John, this doesn't mean you can text me whenever you want." 3 dots appeared. Paused. "Luke." "Understood." "Luke, I just wanted to say, thank you for earlier." "Luke, you're doing an incredible job." John closed his eyes. Praise from colleagues bounced off him. Concern from strangers annoyed him. But this landed somewhere tender. "John, don't make a habit of it." "Luke, I won't." "Luke, good night, John." John didn't reply, but when he went to bed, the weight in his chest felt steadier. Not lighter, just balanced, like something had been placed carefully, not forced. He hated how much that meant. Chapter 7, in which John loses an argument to a child. John Marshall discovered 2 immutable truths on Tuesday morning. First, 6th graders could smell emotional instability the way sharks smelled blood. Second, he should never, under any circumstances, text Luke Cowell before coffee. "Luke, morning." Hope today's kind to you. John stared at the message while Tony smeared banana on the highchair tray like a tiny abstract artist. This is why we don't encourage people, John told the baby. Tony squealed and slapped the tray. Yes, I know, John sighed. I'm very funny. At school, the chaos was immediate. Mr. Marshall, Kevin announced loudly. I Googled age gaps. John froze mid-attendance. Why? John asked carefully. Would you do that? Kevin shrugged. My cousin married someone 20 years older. Mom said it was weird. The room buzzed. John set his clipboard down. Kevin, sit. Everyone else, stop looking at me like I'm a public service announcement. Raina raised her hand. Is this about your boyfriend? I do not have a... John stopped. Breathed. No. That pause says yes, Kevin said. John pointed at the board. Ancient China. Now, the universe, of course, was not done with him. At lunch, he received a voicemail from an unknown number. Luke, this is your mother. You forgot your jacket. And your priorities. John listened in horror before realizing Luke had accidentally pocket-dialed him. He deleted the voicemail, then immediately wished he hadn't. That evening, daycare pickup was a circus. Tony refused his shoes. Another toddler screamed in solidarity. John knelt well-crouched at Tony's level. Listen, John said seriously. You cannot walk barefoot in public. People already judge me. Luke's laugh came from behind him. John closed his eyes. Of course. Luke stood a few feet away, holding a tiny sock like a peace offering. He dropped this. Tony brightened instantly. You are bribing my child, John accused. With footwear, Luke said. Very unethical. They walked together briefly before Luke spoke again. My parents want to meet you. John stopped short. No. Luke blinked. I haven't even finished the sentence. No, John repeated. They will hate me. I'm short, tired, and come with a baby. Luke smiled. They already hate the idea of you. That's worse. Luke sobered. They think I'm throwing my future away. John folded his arms. And you're not. Luke considered that. I think I'm choosing something. Tony reached for Luke's watch. Luke let him. John watched, helplessly fond. I don't fit in your world, John said quietly. Luke tilted his head. You don't have to. That night, John tucked Tony in and leaned against the crib longer than usual. You're ruining my life, he whispered affectionately. Tony gurgled. John's phone buzzed. Luke, I know today was a lot. Luke, for what it's worth, you made me laugh. John snorted despite himself. John, I do that accidentally. Luke, that might be my favorite kind. John set the phone down, heart doing something inconvenient. Comedy, he realized, was dangerous too. Chapter 8, The Tall People Problem. John Marshall had always suspected that the world was designed by tall people. Tall shelves, tall door frames, tall expectations. Tall men who leaned casually against walls like gravity was a suggestion. He was thinking about this when Luke Cowell's parents walked into the cafe. Together, at the same time, like a synchronized nightmare. Oh no, John muttered into his coffee. They brought backups. Luke's mother was elegant in the way that screamed, I own at least 3 blazers for emergencies. Luke's father was equally polished, radiating the calm confidence of a man who had never assembled his own furniture. They were both tall. John adjusted his posture out of pure spite. Mom, Dad, Luke said, standing. This is John. They looked down. John looked up. The universe held its breath. So, Luke's mother said, smiling thinly, you're shorter than I imagined. John smiled back, sweet and sharp. And you're ruder than I hoped. Luke coughed. Hard. Luke's father cleared his throat. We don't mean to intrude. You are succeeding anyway, John said. Luke grinned. Traitor. They sat. John refused to use the booster cushion the cafe offered him on principle. So, Luke's mother began, folding her hands. Luke tells us you're a teacher. Yes, John said. I specialize in history and sarcasm. Both are underappreciated. And you're... She hesitated. Raising a child? My nephew, John corrected. Tony, 1 year old, terrifyingly intelligent, already judges all of us. As if summoned, Tony chose that moment to loudly drop a spoon from his high chair. Clang. The entire cafe flinched. Luke's father blinked. He's expressive. He's autistic, John said calmly. And that was a critique of the service. Luke's mother pressed her lips together. Luke is very young. John nodded. I've noticed. He still thinks brunch is a personality. Luke gasped. It is. John continued. You're worried I'm a phase. Luke's father sighed. We're worried he's limiting himself. John leaned back. I am 5'4", sleep-deprived, and smell faintly of baby wipes. If this is a rebellion, he's doing it wrong. Tony flung another spoon. Luke applauded softly. He agrees. Luke's mother frowned. This isn't funny. John tilted his head. It is to me. Silence. Then Luke spoke. I didn't ask for permission. I asked for respect. His parents stared. John blinked. Oh, that was new. Luke stood straighter. John isn't holding me back. He's holding his life together. Those are different things. Tony clapped enthusiastically. Luke's father rubbed his temples. We raised you better than this. John raised a finger. Objection. Everyone looked at him. You raised him to care, John said. Unfortunately, that has consequences. Luke's mother exhaled sharply. This won't last. John shrugged. Most things don't. That doesn't make them pointless. Tony leaned forward and grabbed Luke's father's tie. There was a collective gasp. Oh, John said mildly. You've been chosen. Luke's father froze, afraid to breathe. Tony giggled. Luke lost it. Full-on laughter. John sipped his coffee. He likes men with power. Luke's mother stared at her husband, then at Tony, then at John. Something shifted. She sighed. He's not what I expected. John smiled. I get that a lot. When they left, Luke walked beside John in silence. Finally, Luke said, You were amazing. John scoffed. I was rude and antagonistic. Luke beamed. You defended yourself. Tony yawned. John adjusted him. I don't do well with tall people ganging up on me. Luke laughed. I'll crouch next time. John snorted. Damn it. That was funny. Chapter 9. The babysitting incident, which was absolutely Luke's fault. John Marshall did not let people babysit. This was not paranoia. This was experience. People meant well. People smiled too much. People said things like, oh, he doesn't look autistic, and have you tried just waiting it out? People were disasters. Luke Cowell was people. Which was why John was currently standing in his kitchen, arms crossed, delivering what could only be described as a legally binding lecture. You do not, John said slowly. Pick him up without warning. Luke nodded seriously. Okay. You do not, John continued. Touch his toys unless invited. Luke nodded again. Got it. And you do not, John finished, pointing. Sing. Luke blinked. Sing. Yes, John said firmly. Babies do not need your acoustic rendition of anything. Tony sat on the floor between them, stacking blocks with intense concentration, completely uninterested in the adults arguing over his existence. Luke raised a hand. Hypothetically. No. Luke sighed. Okay. John grabbed his keys. I will be gone exactly 47 minutes. There is food prepared. There are instructions. There is a backup plan taped to the fridge. Luke glanced at the fridge. Why are there flowcharts? Because I plan ahead. Luke smiled. I like that about you. John paused, narrowed his eyes. That was flirting. Yes, Luke admitted. John left before he could say something regrettable like thank you. John returned 40 minutes later to silence. That was problem number 1. The apartment was too quiet. No humming. No toy noises. No chaos. Just peace. This is wrong, John muttered, unlocking the door. Inside, Tony was seated neatly on the rug. Luke sat cross-legged across from him. Between them, blocks. They were color-sorted. Perfectly. Tony looked up, saw John, and smiled. John froze. Luke glanced up too. "Hey!" "What?" John said carefully. "Did you do?" Luke shrugged. "We built a city." Tony knocked one tower over. Delighted. Luke applauded softly. Tony giggled. John stared. "You followed the rules," John said suspiciously. Luke nodded. John leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching Luke's expensive shirt slowly lose the battle. "You're drowning," John observed. Luke grinned. "Worth it." Tony slapped water directly into Luke's face. Luke gasped dramatically. "Betrayal." Tony shrieked with laughter. John laughed again. Louder. "You're ridiculous," John said. Luke wiped water from his face. "You're smiling." Temporary condition. After Tony was asleep, Luke collapsed onto the couch. "I passed, right?" John considered him. Wet hair. Tired eyes. Still smiling. "You didn't break anything," John admitted. "That's impressive." Luke grinned. "High praise." John hesitated. "You can babysit again." Luke froze. "Really? Don't get cocky." Luke smiled anyway. John looked away, heart doing something inconvenient. This was bad. This was very, very funny. And he was absolutely doomed. Chapter 10. John declares war on a high chair. John Marshall had fought many battles in his life. Faculty meetings. Parent-teacher conferences. The great finger paint incident of 2019. None of them prepared him for the high chair. It stood in the kitchen like a smug piece of modern art. All angles and misplaced optimism. John stared at it with the expression of a man about to lose his last shred of dignity. Luke watched from the doorway, sipping coffee. "You look like you're about to challenge it to a duel." "It started this," John said darkly, holding up an instruction manual that was clearly written by someone who hated humanity. "Why does it need 17 parts?" Luke leaned over his shoulder. "That's not a screw." John glared at him. "I know that. You're holding a spoon." John paused, looked at his hand. "In my defense," he said, "I am very tired." Tony sat on the floor, chewing thoughtfully on a plastic dinosaur, completely unconcerned by the impending furniture-based violence. "I can help," Luke offered. "No," John said immediately. "You helped yesterday. That was a fluke." Luke smiled. "You said I could babysit again." "I did not say assemble cursed furniture." Too late. Luke had already crouched down, sleeves rolled up, optimism radiating from his entire too-tall body. 20 minutes later, the high chair stood complete. John stared at it, then at Luke. "I hate that you're competent." Luke beamed. "I thrive on quiet resentment." Tony crawled over, examined the chair, then slapped it. "It's approved," Luke said. John sighed. "Of course it is." The universe, sensing John's fragile calm, immediately escalated. That afternoon, John attempted to cook while Luke entertained Tony. This involved Luke narrating Tony's every move like a sports commentator. "And he goes for the block. Strong grip. Oh. Immediate mouth contact. Bold strategy." "Please stop encouraging him," John called from the stove. Tony squealed. Luke grinned. "He loves it." Tony promptly crawled into the kitchen and sat directly at Luke's feet. Luke froze. "Am I trapped?" "Yes," John said calmly. "If you move, he'll scream." Luke whispered, "I don't want to alarm him." Tony leaned forward and pressed his forehead against Luke's shin. Luke looked like he'd been knighted. John watched, heart doing something stupid. "Don't read into that," John muttered. Luke glanced up. Too late. Dinner was chaos. Tony rejected the spoon, rejected the bowl, rejected the concept of food as a whole. John braced himself. Luke leaned in. "May I attempt diplomacy?" John gestured dramatically. "Be my guest, ambassador." Luke offered Tony the spoon. Tony slapped it away. Luke nodded solemnly. "Understood." He picked up the spoon, ate the food himself. Tony froze. Luke chewed exaggeratedly. "Wow, Delicious. Truly tragic, there's none left. Tony stared, then lunged for the spoon. John gasped. That has never worked. Luke grinned. Reverse psychology. John pointed at him. You are banned from reading parenting books. Tony ate happily. John collapsed into a chair. I'm being replaced. Luke shrugged. I'll try not to stage a coup. Later, Luke's phone rang. He answered casually. Hey, Mom. John immediately began stacking dishes with unnecessary aggression. Yes, Luke said. I'm busy. Pause. Luke glanced at John, then at Tony, who was now attempting to climb the couch like Everest. No, Luke continued. I'm not coming home tonight. Longer pause. Yes, I'm serious. John froze. Luke smiled faintly. Because this matters. He hung up. The apartment went quiet. John swallowed. You didn't have to do that. Luke shrugged. I wanted to. Tony toppled dramatically onto Luke's lap. Luke winced. And I appear to be trapped again. John laughed. Full-bodied. Unrestrained. You're stuck, he said cheerfully. Forever. Luke smiled up at him. Worth it. At bedtime, Tony refused to sleep unless Luke sat on the floor beside the crib. Luke did so without complaint, long legs folded awkwardly. John leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. You're going to regret this when he expects you every night. Luke yawned. I'm already regretting my spine. Tony finally drifted off. Luke stood slowly, joints popping. I'm too young to feel this old, he muttered. John smirked. Welcome to my life. They stood there, quiet. You know, Luke said lightly, most people my age are out drinking. John raised an eyebrow. And you're here, assembling furniture and negotiating with a baby. Luke smiled. I feel like I'm winning. John looked away, cheeks warm. This is temporary, he said firmly. Luke nodded. Everything is. But he didn't sound sad. And John didn't correct him. Because for the first time in a long while, chaos felt manageable. And that was terrifying. Chapter 11, the math finally kicks in. John Marshall realized things had gone too far when he started planning around Luke. Not with Luke. Around him. He caught himself thinking things like Luke can babysit Thursday and Luke would like this joke and, most damningly, Luke is tall enough to reach that shelf. That last one made him furious. This is how it happens, John muttered, standing on a chair in the kitchen, reaching for a box of cereal that had no business living that high. You let one absurdly tall man into your life and suddenly you're dependent. Luke, seated at the table and feeding Tony tiny pieces of banana, looked up. I can get that. No, John snapped. I have legs. Luke blinked. You're on a chair. Exactly. Tony slapped the table approvingly. John got the cereal. Barely. He climbed down, triumphant, then immediately banged his knee on the counter. Luke winced. That was fine, John said through clenched teeth. I'm fine. Gravity and I are in negotiations. Luke bit his lip to keep from laughing. John saw it. Do not. Luke failed. John pointed at him. One more sound and you're banned from breakfast. Tony laughed. Loudly. Oh good, John said dryly. The child has chosen violence. The problem with Luke being around more was that John's carefully constructed denial had no room to breathe. Luke fit into their routine with alarming ease. He didn't disrupt, he adjusted. He learned Tony's rhythms faster than John liked and learned John's tells even faster. You're tired, Luke said one evening, watching John stare blankly at the microwave. I'm always tired, John replied. This is the kind where you forget you're holding a fork. John looked down. I was wondering where that went. Luke gently took the fork and handed him a plate. Sit. John bristled. I didn't ask. I know, Luke said easily. You still need to. That was the problem. Luke didn't make John feel managed. He made him feel seen, which was infinitely worse. The breaking point came at school. It was career day. John had forgotten. He stood at the front of his classroom, staring at a parade of parents in suits, scrubs, uniforms, and one enthusiastic influencer with a ring light, while his students vibrated with excitement. Remember, John said wearily. No asking how much money people make. That's rude and depressing. A hand shot up. Kevin. Of course. Mr. Marshall, Kevin asked loudly. How old do you have to be successful? John opened his mouth, then stopped. I don't know, he said honestly. I'll let you know when I get there. Laughter rippled through the room, but it stuck with him. That night, John watched Luke help Tony stack blocks. Patient, playful, completely present. Luke was 20. He had time John didn't. Options John had already spent. A future that could still be rearranged. John cleared his throat. Luke. Luke looked up. Yeah. You should go out, John said abruptly. With people your age. Luke blinked. I am. John gestured vaguely. Out. Loud. Regrettable. Luke smiled. This is loud and regrettable. I'm serious, John said. You're wasting time here. Luke studied him. You don't actually believe that. John snapped. I believe you'll wake up one day and realize I'm old. Silence fell. Tony knocked a tower over. Oblivious. Luke set a block down carefully. You're not old. I'm almost 40, John said. My knees make sounds. So do mine, Luke said. They're just newer sounds. John didn't laugh. That's not funny, Luke added quietly. That's fear. John swallowed. You don't get it. Luke stood. Not defensive. Just steady. I get that you think you're protecting me, Luke said. But you're deciding my future without asking. John looked away. Someone has to be responsible. Luke's voice softened. You already are. For Tony. For your students. For everyone. Tony crawled toward John and climbed into his lap, pressing his face into John's chest. John held him tightly. That doesn't mean, Luke continued gently. You don't get to want things too. John laughed weakly. I don't even know what I want. Luke met his eyes. I do. That scared him more than anything so far. That night, after Luke left early, quiet, respectful, hurt, John lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan. He did the math over and over. Years. Energy. Time. For the first time, the age gap wasn't theoretical. It was loud. And it was heavy. And no amount of humor could make it disappear. Chapter 12, The Audacity of Missing Someone. John Marshall discovered two things in the same week. Luke Cowell was very good at respecting boundaries. John hated that about him. Luke didn't text. Didn't accidentally show up. Didn't linger near John Street like a guilty stray cat. He vanished with politeness, which frankly felt rude. John told himself this was good, healthy, mature, exactly what he wanted. John also yelled at the toaster on Wednesday because it burned his bread slightly. Wow, he told it bitterly. You too. Tony, seated in his high chair, dropped cereal on the floor in silent judgment. Don't start, John warned the baby. I am one minor inconvenience away from crying in public. Tony clapped. School was worse. Without Luke around, John's sense of humor sharpened into something feral. His students noticed immediately. When a kid asked, Mr. Marshall, why are you so short? John smiled sweetly, dangerously, because every inch I didn't grow went directly into my personality. The class laughed. Also, John added, anyone who asks that question again will be assigned a 10-page essay on the Industrial Revolution. No one asked again. During lunch, his co-teacher Maria eyed him over her salad. You're doing that thing. What thing? The brooding thing, she said. You only do that when you're tired or emotionally compromised. I'm neither. You tried to grade papers with a red pen that was actually pink. John looked down. It was misleading. Maria leaned in. Tall intern boy? John groaned. Can we not label people by their skeletal advantages? Yes, she said. But will we? No. Good, Maria said cheerfully. Because you're miserable. John poked at his food. He's young. So was I when I made questionable choices. That's not comforting. I'm not comforting you, Maria said. I'm reminding you that you don't get to opt out of happiness just because it's inconvenient. John muttered. That feels like a personal attack. The universe, traitor that it was, reintroduced Luke on Friday afternoon. John was at the pediatric clinic with Tony, who had decided vaccines were a personal betrayal. John bounced him gently, whispering reassurances, when a familiar voice said, "Hey!" John froze. Luke stood a few feet away, holding a folder, dressed neatly but casually, like he'd put effort in and then pretended he hadn't. "Oh," John said. "Brilliant. Eloquent. Pulitzer-worthy." Luke smiled, cautious. "I didn't know you came here." John sighed. "Tony's doctor. Don't worry. I don't think you stalked me." Luke relaxed. "Good. I was worried my reputation was at risk." Tony looked up, stared, then leaned toward Luke with grabby hands. Luke blinked. "Is that permission?" John handed Tony over automatically, then stiffened. "I mean, if you want." Too late. Tony had already latched onto Luke's shirt. Luke laughed softly. "Guess I'm trapped." John watched him soothe Tony with practiced ease, humming under his breath. It twisted something in John's chest, tender and sharp at the same time. They sat together, awkward but familiar. "I've missed you," Luke said quietly. John winced. "You weren't supposed to." Luke smirked. "Yeah, well, I'm bad at instructions." John hesitated. "You're okay." Luke nodded. "I am. I didn't want to push." That word again. Push. John exhaled slowly. "I didn't mean to make you feel like a mistake." Luke looked at him seriously. "You didn't. You made me feel temporary." Ouch. John rubbed his face. "I don't know how to stop being afraid." Luke considered this. "Maybe don't stop. Just don't let it drive." John snorted. "You're 20 and you're already wiser than me. That's insulting." Luke grinned. "I contain multitudes." Tony yawned dramatically. "Well," Luke said gently, "I should go." John panicked. "Wait." Luke paused. John swallowed. "I can't promise I'll figure this out fast." Luke stepped closer. "I'm not asking for fast. A beat. Can we?" John said carefully. "Maybe try again?" Luke's smile was slow, earned. "I was hoping you'd say that." Tony chose that moment to spit up on Luke's shoulder. Luke laughed. "Wow, baptized." John laughed too. Real helpless laughter. "Welcome back," he said. For the first time in days, the world felt less heavy. Still complicated. Still scary. But no longer empty. Chapter 13, The Second Time is Worse. John Marshall had already met Luke Cowell's parents once. Technically, briefly, publicly, while caffeinated and unprepared. Which meant this, being invited to their house for dinner with intent, was objectively worse. "You can't call that a meeting," John insisted, pacing his apartment while Luke sat on the couch, Tony chewing on a toy at his feet. "That was an ambush." Luke smiled. "You did insult my mom. She started it. She commented on your height." "Exactly." Luke leaned back. "They thought you were memorable." John stopped pacing. "That's not comforting." Luke hesitated. "They want to actually talk to you, properly. No cafe. No audience." John pinched the bridge of his nose. "So this is the sequel?" "Yes." "I hate sequels," John muttered. "They expect character development." Tony babbled loudly, smacking his toy against the floor like punctuation. Luke took a breath. "You don't have to do this." John looked at him. Really looked. Luke wasn't pushing. Wasn't hovering. Wasn't managing John's fear for him, which somehow made it harder. "No," John said finally. "I do." Luke blinked. "You do." John sighed. "I already survived your mother once. I refused to let her win by default." Luke laughed, relieved. "Dinner's Friday." "Of course it is." John spent Friday afternoon glaring at his closet. "I don't own rich people clothes," he informed Tony. Tony chewed thoughtfully. Luke appeared in the doorway. "You look fine." "I look like a man who owns one blazer and resentment." Luke grinned. "That's my type." The Cowell house was still intimidating. Not in a loud way. in a quiet confidence way, like it knew it was impressive and didn't need validation. John stepped inside and immediately felt like his shoes were being judged. Eleanor Cowell greeted them with a composed smile, less sharp than at the cafe, but no less observant. "John," she said, "thank you for coming." John nodded. "Thank you for inviting me somewhere I can't escape." Luke's father, Richard, shook John's hand firmly. "We thought it was time to speak properly." John replied, "I appreciate the warning. Dinner was careful. Not cold. Not warm. Measured." They talked about John's teaching, Tony's routines, Luke's work. No one mentioned the cafe. No one mentioned age. John waited anyway. Eventually, Eleanor folded her napkin. "I'll be honest." John straightened. "Please do. I teach honesty for a living." "We were surprised," she said, "by Luke's certainty." John nodded. "So was I." Richard studied him. "You understand why we worry?" "Yes," John said immediately. "Because I worry too." Luke turned to him. "John." "I do," John continued. "I worry about time, about energy, about becoming something you grow past." Silence. Luke reached for his hand under the table. Eleanor's voice softened. "And yet you're here." John met her gaze. "Because loving him doesn't feel careless. It feels deliberate." Richard leaned back. "I don't love the age gap." John nodded. "Neither do I." A beat. "But," John added, "I love your son." Luke's ears turned red. Eleanor smiled despite herself. Richard exhaled. "Then be good to each other." "We are," Luke said firmly. John squeezed his hand. "We're trying very hard." On the way home, John slumped into the passenger seat. "Well," he said, "that was worse than the cafe." Luke laughed. "You didn't insult anyone this time." "I showed restraint." Tony slept peacefully in the back. John stared out the window. "They didn't scare me as much as I expected." Luke glanced at him. "That's because you didn't shrink." John smirked. "I refuse on principle." Nothing had changed. The age gap was still there. The fear still lingered. But the ground beneath them felt steadier. And for John Marshall, that was everything. Chapter 14, Choosing the Complicated Thing. John Marshall had always believed that if something was too complicated, it probably wasn't meant for him. Complicated things required energy, negotiation, hope. He preferred lesson plans and routines and knowing exactly how many hours of sleep he wouldn't get. So it was deeply unfair that he woke up on Saturday morning feeling optimistic. He hated it. Tony was already awake, standing in his crib like a tiny inmate. John lifted him out, pressed a kiss to his hair, and sighed. "Don't look at me like that," John told him. "I'm emotionally fragile today." Tony smiled. Traitor. Luke arrived an hour later with coffee, pastries, and the audacity to look relaxed. John eyed the bag. "You're bribing us." Luke grinned. "I'm courting responsibly." Tony grabbed Luke's sleeve immediately. Luke scooped him up. "See? I'm winning," John muttered. "He likes anyone with good knees." Luke laughed. "Rude." They sat on the couch, Tony between them, cartoons playing softly. It felt domestic in a way that made John nervous. Too easy. Too real. Luke noticed. Of course he did. "You're thinking too loud," Luke said. John snorted. "You don't even know what I'm thinking." Luke shrugged. "Something about how this feels good and that scares you." John stared. "I hate how accurate you are." Luke smiled gently. "I know. That did it." John stood abruptly. "We need to talk." Tony squeaked in protest as Luke adjusted his grip. Luke nodded. "Okay." John paced. "I can't promise you forever." Luke blinked. "No one can." "I can't give you kids." Luke raised an eyebrow. "We're literally holding one." "You know what I mean," John snapped. "I can't give you a clean future." Luke stood, calm but firm. "John, look at me." John stopped. Luke stepped closer. "I'm not choosing you because it's simple. I'm choosing you because it's honest." John laughed bitterly. "You're 20. You don't even know who you'll be in 10 years. Luke smiled. Neither do you. That's not a flaw. That's being alive. Tony yawned loudly. Luke glanced down. He agrees. John rubbed his face. I'm scared I'll wake up one day and you'll resent me. Luke answered without hesitation. I'm scared you'll push me away and call it kindness. Silence. John swallowed. I don't want to be your lesson, he said quietly. Luke cupped John's cheek. You're not. You're my choice. John's eyes burned. You shouldn't have to fight my fears. Luke leaned in, forehead touching his. Then don't make me fight alone. John let out a shaky breath. For once, he didn't make a joke. I choose you too, he said. Even if I'm bad at it. Luke smiled, soft, relieved. Real. You're doing fine. Tony clapped. The test came faster than expected. Luke's parents invited them to a charity event. John stared at the invitation. This looks expensive. Luke shrugged. It is. I will embarrass you. I'm counting on it. John sighed. Fine. But if anyone asks what I do, I'm saying wizard. At the event, John felt wildly out of place. Tall people everywhere. Suits. Champagne. Luke stayed close. Always close. When someone asked John how old he was, Luke answered before John could. He's perfect, Luke said pleasantly. John choked on his drink. Later, Luke's father pulled John aside. I won't pretend this is easy, Richard said. But Luke hasn't looked this sure about anything. John nodded. I won't waste that. Richard studied him, then extended a hand. That's all I needed to hear. John shook it, stunned. Luke watched from across the room, eyes bright. When they got home, exhausted, Tony asleep, John collapsed onto the couch. I survived rich people, he said. Luke laughed and leaned in. Barely. John turned to him. I still don't know how this ends. Luke kissed him, slow, certain. Me neither. John smiled. For the first time, the uncertainty didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a choice. Chapter 15, The Future with Commentary. John Marshall did not believe in signs. Signs were vague. Signs were misleading. Signs were how people ended up making impulsive decisions like buying white couches or trusting group chats. So when 3 different people asked him the same question in one day, he refused to acknowledge the universe was trying to tell him something. Mr. Marshall? Kevin said during homeroom, raising his hand like he was about to accuse someone in court. Are you married? John blinked. No. Do you have a girlfriend? No. Do you have a boyfriend? The class leaned forward. John sighed. I have a headache. Later that day, Maria leaned into his classroom doorway. So, you and tall intern boy still a thing? John didn't look up from his papers. He has a name. Sure, she said. And skyscrapers have floors. John glared. Yes, we're still a thing. Maria smiled. Good. You were unbearable when you weren't. I'm always unbearable. True, she agreed. But now you're glowing. John paused. I will be filing a complaint. That night at home, Tony refused to sleep unless Luke was present. Luke sat on the floor beside the crib, reading a children's book with full dramatic flair. And the cow said, Moo, Tony babbled. Luke gasped. Spoilers. John watched from the doorway, heart doing that stupid, inconvenient softening thing again. When Tony finally fell asleep, Luke stood and stretched. He's getting heavier. John smirked. Welcome to my daily workout. Luke turned to him. You're good at this. John shrugged. I didn't plan on it. You didn't plan on me either, Luke said lightly. John sighed. Still not convinced you weren't a clerical error. Luke laughed and stepped closer. John. That tone. John braced himself. Yes. Luke took a breath. I got a job offer. There it was. The fear rose instantly, sharp and familiar. Oh, John said carefully. That's great. Luke nodded. It is. It's with my parents' company. John swallowed. Where? Luke watched his face closely. Here. John froze. Here. They want me permanent, Luke continued. I said I'd only accept if I wasn't expected to move. John stared at him. You turned down other offers? Luke shrugged. I know what I want. John's voice cracked. You can't make life decisions around me. Luke smiled gently. I'm not. I'm making them with you in mind. John sat down hard on the couch. You're terrifying. Luke sat beside him. You love it. John leaned back, exhaling. I'm scared. I know. I'll mess this up. Probably. John snorted despite himself. You're not helping. Luke nudged him. You're still here. That was true. 2 weeks later, John's classroom was unusually quiet. The kids were working on projects, whispering conspiratorially. Kevin approached again. Of course he did. Mr. Marshall, Kevin said. Is it true you're in love? John closed his eyes. Who told you that? Kevin grinned. You smile more. Rude. John sighed. Yes, I am. Kevin nodded sagely. My mom says love is scary. John smiled softly. Your mom is very smart. That night, John stood in his kitchen, staring at Luke, who was chopping vegetables too enthusiastically. You're going to lose a finger, John said. Worth it. No. Luke laughed. What's up? You've been quiet. John took a breath. I don't know what the future looks like. Luke nodded. Neither do I. But, John continued, I know I don't want to imagine it without you. Luke's smile was slow. That sounds suspiciously like commitment. John pointed. Do not label it. Luke stepped closer. John. John met his eyes. I'm in. Not because it's easy. Not because it makes sense. But because you and Tony, you feel like home. Luke kissed him warm, steady. Sure. Tony chose that moment to cry from the other room. John sighed. And that's my cue. Luke laughed. Our cue. They went together. Later, with Tony asleep between them on the couch, John rested his head on Luke's shoulder. You know, John murmured, people are going to judge us. Luke kissed his hair. Let them. John smiled. Okay. For the first time in a long time, John Marshall didn't need certainty. He had love. He had laughter. He had a future tall, complicated, and entirely his.